This year's 4.5-hour Talladega playoff race ends in controversy. Did NASCAR make the right call? How's it going, y'all? My name is Eric, and welcome to Out of the Groove. We have so much to get to here tonight, so thank you for joining us. As you can see, we're getting into some of the fall season spirit, and that's a great segue to introduce Out of the Groove's newest sponsor, Jockey. Jockey, from your first layer to your last. Find everything you need to stay warm and comfortable this season at jockey.com. The weather's starting to get a little bit cooler, so thankfully my friends at Jockey sent me this fantastic flannel shirt. The Jockey traditional flannel shirt, like the one I'm wearing, is a must-have style this fall. It's a super soft brushed cotton shirt that's perfect for when the temps start to drop. Reach for this flannel every day and every race. Visit jockey.com today to get yours. There's only one Jockey, crafting comfort since 1876. A big thank you to Jockey for keeping me warm this fall. We do have so much to get to tonight. The playoff Talladega race rarely lets us down. This year's race was all over the place, quite frankly. I don't even know where to start. We're going to talk about the top finishers from tonight's race. We're going to talk about the several big ones, which playoff drivers specifically that those affected the most. We're going to talk about some of the exciting underdog performers. We're going to talk about NBC's handling of the end of today's race. And of course, we're going to put this thing on the groovy gauge at the very end. So we have a lot to get to. Let's start with the finish of today's race, the thing that had everyone talking after the checkered flag. So first off, this race was 4.5 hours long. It was saddled by 2 red flags for 2 massive crashes. We'll talk about the one that had Kurt Busch surfing across traffic at one point in this race. We'll talk about that later, but ultimately it set up a triple overtime. The third attempt at overtime, you had Matt DiBenedetto, Chris Buescher on their last legs of fuel, trying to lead the field at the very end. Denny Hamlin, his teammate Eric Jones, William Byron were up there as well with plenty of fuel in the tank, trying to get a run on those 2 fast Fords. And let's just unpack this final half a lap. Coming out of turn 4, you see side by side William Byron looking to the inside of Matt DiBenedetto. DiBenedetto comes down and clearly forces William Byron below the double yellow line, which is of course a penalty. Joey Logano got called for this penalty earlier in the race. But behind them, Denny Hamlin goes onto the apron to pass Chris Buescher first and foremost, and then continues to ride the apron out of turn 4 to get ahead of Matt DiBenedetto and William Byron. And then everyone pushing, of course, to the line. Denny Hamlin ends up edging Matt DiBenedetto by just a couple of feet to get his 7th win of the season. Matt DiBenedetto crossed the line in second. My dad actually pointed out after the race that Denny Hamlin's just teasing Matt DiBenedetto at this point. But of course, if you look at everything that transpired there coming out of turn 4, it was clear that something wasn't right. You know, at Daytona and Talladega, if you move below the double yellow line to advance your position, that is typically a penalty. Now, there are some caveats to it. If you're forced below the yellow line, as far as you're next to a car and the other car forces you down there, that's not a penalty. But looking back at that replay, it's really hard. I mean, it is very difficult to determine whether or not Denny Hamlin should have been penalized or not. Because ultimately NASCAR, after taking a few moments to review that final incident, NASCAR ultimately declared Denny Hamlin the winner, and they actually gave Matt DiBenedetto a penalty. I believe he was credited with a 21st place finish for forcing William Byron below the yellow line. That was the correct call. I will start there. That was the correct call. Matt DiBenedetto clearly forced William Byron below the double yellow line. Byron had position on him. DiBenedetto made a late block trying to get his first career win. That was a fair penalty. I mean, it sucks. I was rooting for Matt DiBenedetto at the end there, but it was the right call. But then the question turns to, was the no call on Denny Hamlin the correct call? And I'll say this, after watching the replay 1, 2, I'd say even 3 times, I didn't think it was. To me, it looked like Denny Hamlin could have avoided going to the inside lane. He wasn't forced to the bottom quite the same way William Byron was. And then the fact that Hamlin stayed below the double yellow line for pretty much the entirety of turn 4 and even onto the front straightaway partially. He stayed down there for a long, long time, made very little effort to come back onto the racing surface. To me, after looking at those replays several times, I thought Hamlin should have been penalized. I know this is a very difficult rule to enforce. Over the 10, 15, 20 years I've been watching NASCAR, I've seen this rule go many different directions. 2003, they didn't penalize Dale Jr. when it looked like he went below the yellow line. But then there's the Regan Smith incident from years ago where I think that was probably an unfair penalty call. NASCAR doesn't have to make this call at the end of races very often, and it's rarely as difficult to call as this was. Obviously, the Matt DiBenedetto coming down Byron, that was an easy call. I think most people, if you look at it objectively, would agree that yes, Matt DiBenedetto forced Byron below the double yellow line. That's the right call. That's an easy one to make. The Hamlin one's harder because when NASCAR ultimately decided not to penalize Denny Hamlin, I tried looking at that replay for the 4th time and the 5th time, and there I could maybe see where they're coming from. I mean, it is tough to say whether or not Hamlin might have been forced below the yellow line by Chris Buescher. It was really close. I personally think Hamlin could have still lifted or gone to the outside. I don't think he was quite next to Buescher yet when Buescher came down and forced him below the yellow line. But okay, you could argue, sure, it's close. You could argue that Denny Hamlin was forced below the yellow line by Chris Buescher, so that's fine. And then you could argue that when DiBenedetto and Byron made contact, you could argue then that maybe Hamlin was just avoiding a wreck, which typically during a wreck avoidance, you are kind of allowed to go below the yellow line to dodge a wreck. That's the only argument I can see NASCAR making, because from where I was standing, I definitely think Denny Hamlin could have avoided going below the double yellow line, and he certainly didn't have to stay below the double yellow line on the apron as long as he did. To me, I think NASCAR still got this call wrong, but it's an extremely difficult call for NASCAR to make, because ultimately there were 3 cars even for the lead coming out of turn 4. Sure, one was kind of down the apron, but you had 3 cars even for the lead, drag racing down the front stretch, and ultimately it was Hamlin who got to the line first. If you call that penalty on Hamlin, and of course you call the one on Matt DiBenedetto, I guess then you'd give the win to the 3rd place finisher, which I guess technically the guy who finished the race 3rd, crossed the line 3rd, was Erik Jones. But I don't know, is it going to sit right with fans to give the win to Erik Jones? Because again, that Denny Hamlin move on Chris Buescher, it's difficult to say whether Hamlin was forced below the yellow line. He very well might have been, which would have justified him riding the apron in turn 4, at least somewhat. So it's an extremely difficult call to make. I don't think NASCAR had a clear answer for this one. You know, this is sort of like in baseball or football. You know, if you make a call on the field and then you go to the replay, you need to find enough evidence to overturn the call on the field. The call on the field in this case was Denny Hamlin's the winner. Did they find enough evidence to overturn that call? I think it's spotty. I think it's very sketchy. It was close between whether or not Buescher forced him down, and then like I said, you could argue that Hamlin was just avoiding the wreck between Byron and DiBenedetto. So personally, I don't really think Denny Hamlin should have been credited with the win. I think they should have called the penalty on the track and then tried to review it after that. That's what I said. That's what I think. But I don't envy the position NASCAR is in. Denny Hamlin ran a smart race. He rode around in the back most of the afternoon because he was just trying to protect his massive points lead. As the flies began to drop in front of him, he worked his way towards the front, and I mean, he nailed that late race restart. I mean, you could just see it. He had more fuel than a lot of the guys. He had better tires than most of the guys. He had one of the cleanest race cars in the top 10. So Denny Hamlin raced a smart race, gets the win. That's his 7th win of the season, his 2nd on super speedways. Remember, he won Daytona earlier in the year. This locks him into the 3rd round of the NASCAR playoffs. So congrats to Denny Hamlin, but certainly this was a controversial finish that will be looked back on probably for years and years. Now we'll look at the top finishers from this race in a moment, but I do want to talk a little bit about how NBC handled today's broadcast, because today's race, like I said at the top of the show, it ran about 4.5 hours long. Multiple red flags, a lot of wrecks, especially early on in the race. We had 3 wrecks, 3 cautions before we even got to the competition yellow on lap 25. So it was a slow race. It was the first NASCAR race in like a month to be broadcast on big NBC, the main network NBC, the big boy channel. So that was super exciting, but with the race continuing to run long, and of course another red flag late in this race before overtime, NBC called an audible and switched the end of the race from NBC to cable, NBC Sports Network. And I gotta say, in the moment, that was a total gut punch. You know, NBC and Fox, for this matter, have been pushing NASCAR for later start times. That's why we've seen so many like 3 p.m. starts this year as opposed to the more traditional noon or 1 starts. Talladega today was technically a 2 p.m. Eastern start, so not as late as other races, but I guess this is kind of a slap to the face because it's the networks. It's not NASCAR. It's the networks pushing NASCAR for these later start times. And then when the races run a little bit long, the networks are really quick on the trigger to back out and put the race on a lesser channel. You know, not as many people have NBCSN as have big NBC, so it's certainly going to hurt the ratings for the end of this race. And from what I can tell, they didn't switch over because like Sunday Night Football was ready to start. No, that was still hours away. They switched over for the local news. I mean, I understand news is important. There's a lot of newsworthy events out there right now, but come on now. If you're going to push NASCAR to start the races later, and then the moment you get, you know, kind of a red flag, I mean, what if this race had been rain delayed? What would have happened then? The whole thing might have been on NBCSN. I don't know. I think NBC was too quick on the trigger. You know, I've been hard on both NBC and Fox with their broadcasts this year. I've probably been harder than in years past, and part of it's been because of COVID-related things, like I talked about in a video earlier this week, or I think I talked about in the live stream yesterday, actually. Not having enough camera guys at the track because of COVID, missing key moments, not having good replays, the broadcasters not being there in person, so missing details there. You know, that's all stuff I can forgive because of COVID, but NBC switching the broadcast over for the final, or I guess there's the final 2 restarts, that's a really tough pill to swallow. I don't want to say it's inexcusable because I'm not going to say, I mean, I have no power over NBC. Nobody, even NASCAR doesn't have that much power over NBC. NBC's massive TV contract is funding most of NASCAR right now, so NASCAR kind of has to do whatever NBC wants it to do. But it is a difficult pill to swallow for race fans to have the end of what was a very eventful, very exciting and controversial race be shown over on cable and taken off the air. There's plenty of people that were watching this race that when it switched to NBCSN could not watch the finish on TV. So that's extremely disappointing, and I feel bad for those people because that's just not fair. NBC's not earning a whole lot of goodwill with NASCAR fans this year. It's unfortunate. All right, now let's move on and talk about some of the top finishers. And as we go, I'm going to talk about a couple of the key moments from today's race, namely a couple pretty big wrecks. So there you have your top finishers, with Matt Benedetto ultimately being credited with a 21st place finish. It's a Joe Gibbs Racing 1-2 at the front of the field. Denny Hamlin and Eric Jones, the Busch Clash winner, finishing second. Look at some of these names. Ty Dillon finishing third. Both Roush Fenway cars in the top 10. Rookies Tyler Reddick and John Hunter Nemechek end up with top 10s as well. Brendan Poole in the top 10, my guy. What a run for the 15 team. Ryan Preece as well was up with the leaders most of this race, especially the second half of this race. Look at that, top 10. The only playoff driver in that top 10, or guy who's still in the playoffs, I should say, is Denny Hamlin. The rest of the top 10, not even playoff drivers. Gosh. Classic Talladega. Justin Haley, who won the Xfinity race yesterday, ends up 11th for Spire Motorsports. Great for him. Austin Dillon in 12th is the second best finishing playoff driver. He also got stage points in stage 1, so he had a pretty good race until he got damaged in some of the later incidents, and still coming back to finish 12th is fantastic. Did as best as he possibly could after a rough first race of this round at Las Vegas last week. Quinn Houff 13th. Quinn! Wow! Timmy Hill gets a top 15 finish. I mean, as is become quite common with some of these super speedways, it's a battle of attrition more than anything, but Timmy Hill 15th, Matt Kenseth gets 16th. He ran in the top 10 for most of the later portion of this race. Cody Ware gets a top 20 right ahead of Kevin Harvick. I mean, how about that? Hey, you tell your grandkids about that. Back at Talladega, that one time I beat Kevin Harvick. I didn't mention it earlier, but Matt Benedetto was not the only driver penalized at the end of this race. Chase Elliott was also penalized for forcing someone below the yellow line, so he actually ended up finishing 22nd. That sucks for Chase Elliott. Not pictured either, but finishing 24th was Bubba Wallace. He led a lot of laps in this race and ultimately got kind of sideswiped up into the wall late in this thing while running like third. I think it was Ryan Preece that got into the back of him. I wouldn't put that on Preece. It was just kind of a racing deal at Talladega, but Bubba came back strong and got back up into the top 10, top 5 until a final big wreck. He kind of came down on, I can't remember who he came down on. I want to say it was Keselowski. I don't think that's right. He came down on somebody. I can't remember off the top of my head and set off one of the overtime wrecks. So tough finish for Bubba, but made a name for himself today. Certainly got a lot of TV time, which was cool to see. Other playoff drivers with bad finishes. Martin Truex Jr. ends up 23rd. Joey Logano, who was quite aggressive in this race, as he typically is at these racetracks, ends up 26th. Kyle Busch. I mean, remember, he said he was going to get eliminated in this round. He's on the path to doing that. He finished 27th after being involved in at least 2 wrecks, maybe more. It was a rough day. He was limping around there, but stayed on the lead lap. Tough day for the SHR guys. Clint Boyer was 33rd. Almirola was 37th. Both were involved in wrecks. Kurt Busch, last week's winner, who has locked himself in the next round, he had the ride of the afternoon. He went flying midway through this race. He ends up finishing 32nd, but that was the big wreck. And I have to give NASCAR some credit. There were a couple pretty big wrecks today. One when Eric Almirola got pinched into the wall and Kyle Busch went around as well. But in those wrecks and in the Kurt Busch wreck, give NASCAR credit. They made an effort since last year to keep these race cars on the ground at the super speedways. They were turning too much horsepower. They're going too fast last year, which allowed too many cars to just take off and fly and flip through the air. Safety is always important, and after Ryan Newman's wreck at Daytona this year, NASCAR has made a few subtle changes to hopefully keep the cars on the ground. And while, yes, Kyle Busch got a little bit of air and Almirola got a little bit of air, and of course Kurt Busch went skating, none of those 3 drivers went flipping. And luckily all those drivers walked away from their wrecks without too much issue. So NASCAR deserves a round of applause right there, because that Kurt Busch wreck was scary. He went head on into the outside wall and then got sent by Cole Custer, I believe it was. And like I said, he was just surfing on top of cars for probably a good 50 yards until he ultimately landed on all 4 wheels. So a scary wreck. There are a lot of cars involved in that one. So it was a difficult day for the playoff drivers. Aside from Harvick and Hamlin, pretty much all the playoff drivers were trying to lead laps, were running up near the front, weren't hanging back too much. It was an extremely competitive race, as Talladega usually is. I accidentally skipped over when we were looking at these finishing results, but Alex Bowman finishing 14th. When I talk about competitive, I mean, this guy, his whole left front was destroyed in one of the early accidents. He stayed on the lead lap and actually ran up with the leaders late in this race, ended up with a 14th place finish. It was a race where the most resilient playoff teams ultimately made up the most points. So Alex Bowman, for that reason, deserves a ton of credit. Their day could have been done in stage 1. Instead, they persevered and made up quite a few points. This could have been a rough day for Alex Bowman. This could have been a really bad day for a number of playoff drivers, but many of them persevered. I mentioned Kyle Busch. Yeah, the finish wasn't great, but it could have been worse. Let's go ahead and look at the playoff grid now with one final race to go in this round, the Charlotte Roval next next week. Going to be exciting, going to be a thriller. Chase Elliott has emerged as the road course king. You see there, he is 6th on the playoff grid, plus 27, a pretty decent cushion, so he doesn't need to win next week, but I'm sure he'd like to get some very important playoff points. You see there, Kevin Harvick is locked in, from what I can tell. Obviously, Hamlin and Kurt Busch are. Brad Keselowski's in a really good spot. I mean, really, everyone's in a good spot. If you really look at this, you know, Logano being involved in that final wreck and Alex Bowman being wrecked early on, I really thought they would end up a lot closer to the cut line. But I mentioned Alex Bowman. This is where his resilience came into play. He finished 14th. If he finishes 30th, I mean, we're talking about him being maybe like plus 5 or 6 over the cut line instead of plus 22. We would have been a lot closer. Unfortunately, though, pretty much all 4 of these drivers below the cut line find themselves probably in a must-win scenario at the Roval. Unless something happens to Chase or Bowman or Logano early on in that race, I think Kyle Busch and Austin Dillon and everyone need to go into that looking to win. I don't have a whole lot of faith in Austin Dillon or Eric Almirola getting that win. Clint Bowyer's a decent road racer. He has a shot. Kyle Busch, he hasn't run well at the Roval at all the last 2 years, but he is a solid road course racer. He's the kind of driver you can never count out, so I will not rule out Kyle Busch, but it certainly does not seem likely. Honestly, if the top 8 can just execute, not make, you know, catastrophic mistakes next week, I have a feeling you're looking at your round of 8 right here, but still one race to go, and the Roval can and has been a wild card in the past, so I'm not going to make any predictions too soon here, but that's how the playoff grid was shaken up. I really thought when Bowman hit the wall or, you know, got taken out early on, I really thought his season might be over. Wow, that team persevered. So a lot of credit to Alex Bowman and company. Overall, this was just a wild Talladega race. It's what you expect when you go to Talladega, especially if you put Talladega in the playoffs. I mean, this is what you expect. Let's put this race on the Groovy Gauge. This is an extremely difficult race to rate because overall, this race was thrilling. I think this super speedway package, I've been saying it for over a year now, I think it's perfect. Yes, they made some tweaks to slow the cars down a little bit after Daytona this year, but Talladega won, Summer Daytona, and this race today, I thought the pack racing was phenomenal. The cars are stable enough that they're comfortable running 2 and 3 wide for almost the entirety of the event. But the runs are big enough still that you can make moves, and occasionally it does lead to, I'd say more often than occasionally, it leads to big bad wrecks. But Talladega has always been known for big bad wrecks, so the occasional big one is to be expected at Talladega. We obviously don't want drivers to get hurt, so I love that NASCAR has taken so many initiatives in terms of safety this year by adding the Newman bar, by slowing the cars down to try and keep them on the ground as much as possible. That's all fantastic. But you certainly expect some big wrecks when you show up to Talladega. So today's race was fantastic for the most part. It was fantastic in that respect. Very competitive all day long, but speaking of long, it ran a little long. Like I said, this was a 4.5 hour race. Now, the 2 red flags were roughly half hour, took about a half hour total, so that of course added to it a bit, but even without the red flags, we're talking about a roughly 4 hour long race. Now, I don't mind it. Well, that's not entirely true. I think 4.5 hours was a little too long, but I typically don't mind slightly longer races from time to time, especially at a place like Talladega where the racing is just so exciting and you're on the edge of your seat basically from start to finish trying to figure out who's going to win, who's going to put themselves in the right position. I mean, literally turn 4 of the final lap, we still don't know who was winning this thing. Even after the checkered flag, we didn't know who'd won this thing. We were waiting for the ruling to come down. So Talladega is super unpredictable. So I don't mind Talladega races and Daytona races and certain big races to be long, but even this one ran a bit long and just dragged. And with them switching it over to NBCSN, that left a sour taste in my mouth at the end of this thing. And ultimately, I mean, the final restart, I mean, really all 3 overtimes because it took 3 overtimes. It was just poorly organized. I get there's a lot of drivers who are desperate. There's a lot of drivers who don't have a plan for next year and are looking to show that they've got what it takes, trying to get a win while they still can. I understand there are a lot of drivers out to prove themselves. It's high stress, high stakes. It's a playoff race, but some of these mistakes being made at the end of this race, there were like 4 big wrecks after the scheduled distance of today's race. Like, that's just a bit absurd. Not every super speedway race with this package has devolved into this. The Busch Clash most notably did. But some of the other super speedway races this year, the Cup guys have been able to kind of take care of each other and just race good and hard and clean at the end. But not today. Not at all. I mean, I was starting to question at the end whether or not Talladega had lights because the sun was going down. That's how long this race took. So it was sloppy at the end. It was sloppy. It was a slugfest. You come to expect a little bit of that at Talladega, but today, by the end of this race, it was a bit too much, and the end of this race dragged. Like NBA basketball games, it feels like it takes hours for the final 2 minutes of game clock to wind out because people are intentionally fouling, there's free throws and stuff. Talladega today was that, but to the extreme. I mean, it literally took more than 30 minutes to run overtime, you know, all 3 overtime. Like, it took way too long to finish today's race, not really because of NASCAR's fault, really just because the drivers couldn't stay off each other. So, and you can't really blame NASCAR for it or Talladega for it or even the networks for it. You can only blame the drivers for running over each other and just not not making good moves, not being smart. But it was still a fun race. The finish and the controversy surrounding it definitely hurt the score, but I'm still gonna give today's Talladega race a 88%. We're gonna go 88. We're gonna go with kind of a weird number there. You know, it's a 188 lap race, or it was supposed to be. We're gonna go with an 88 out of 100. Before overtime, this race was gonna be close to a perfect score, but with all the overtimes, with the sloppy wrecks, and with the just controversial and confusing finish to this race, it hurts the score. It's getting an 88 out of 100. Still a really good race. Still fantastic. I mean, super speedways have been beautiful this year, I must say. It was also cool to see a pretty solid crowd in the stands once again. I understand, you know, I don't know what kind of COVID policies they may or may not have had in place. I know some people who were at the race, but at least watching on TV, it was nice to see. They probably had a good 25 to 30% capacity. It was a solid enough crowd. That was at least sort of a breath of fresh air to see. I liked that. But there you have it. That's my score at 88%. Let me know what you guys thought of tonight's race. I mean, it went so late, man. Whew. Well, that's gonna do it for tonight's episode. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's race. Be sure to subscribe if you are new to the channel. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, a fantastic thank you to my incredible Patreon supporters. A big thank you again to Jockey for sponsoring this episode of Out of the Groove. Really appreciate their support.
You've got these.
Oh, those are my go-tos.
Here's your new go-to.
This is a prank, is what that is.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. Thank you all for watching this episode. We'll be back again very, very soon. Going to be a busy week, I'm sure, leading into the Charlotte Roval cutoff race. Have a great rest of your evening. Have a great rest of your weekend.